Guys, welcome to another episode of Safe Space. My name is Ryan Bass. I'm one of our anchors here at CBS in Tampa, 10 Tampa Bay. Here with Catherine Cooper. I'm so excited to welcome you and have you be a part of this conversation because I think it's really important where we are, especially leading up to the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the work you've done in the veteran community to help heal, especially from PTSD. You are such an expert in this area, and I could tell just kind of by chatting with you prior to this, how passionate you are about it. So I'm really happy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me on. You know, the brain is just really fascinating to me, especially when it comes to trauma. You know, our brains are really powerful.
Well, and you have a lot of work in this area. Just to kind of run through a little bit of what you've done in the past so those watching can understand. You work currently at the Genesis Counseling of South Tampa, but you've done clinical work at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. You still work with veterans in your private practice, and your specialty really has been on PTSD and trauma. You're a licensed mental health counselor, of course. You got your master's degree at USF. So you know better than anybody else, really, what this topic of PTSD really is about and kind of parsing through that with some military vets and those that have served in our country. I just want to first kick it off with, can you just describe to the audience, we hear PTSD, like post-traumatic stress disorder, but can you really dive into what it is? What are the signs of it? So that way, if there are veterans watching or those that are military spouses, they can maybe identify if their loved one or their friend or their family member is suffering from PTSD.
Absolutely. So the whole PTSD diagnosis gets really complicated, especially if you're looking at, you know, the DSM-5. But really what happens is, well, if it's okay with you, can I kind of explain the mechanics of it?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I like to, you know, give it to my clients because I think it's really helpful understanding what our brain is doing and why it's doing that. So essentially what happens is our brain is not recording that memory appropriately. So a traumatic event happens and our lower brain, which is our animal brain or reptilian brain, whatever you want to call it, is hyperactive. And then our rational and reasoning brain, that kind of deactivates. And so we're processing this memory from that internal alarm system that we have, that fight, flight, or freeze. So that's kind of why we sometimes have, you know, experiences. It's really experiencing it through our sensory system. So, you know, the car backfiring and that hypervigilance, it's all kind of coming back. Or, you know, certain smells or visionary stuff. All that kind of plays a role into it. And so our rational and reasoning brain is not part of that memory. So it's really about learning to recode that memory. So, you know, that's a big piece of it. Looking for, you know, when it comes to your loved ones, you know, looking for, you know, isolation, maybe some disassociative stuff like flashbacks, dreams, nightmares, that's really big. You know, because our brain needs to recode that memory. And so it's coming out in our dreams. You know, hypervigilance, any exaggerated negative views like the world is terrible, everyone's bad, I'm bad. Those are really important things to look for as well.
You know, I was reading a lot more about this and how common it is for our military veterans to suffer from PTSD. You mentioned dreams, like that's what I think of, right? Like maybe some of those that have served waking up in the middle of the night, reimagining themselves back on the battlefield and kind of that stress and putting basically their cognitive brain being back in that place, right? Where it's that fight or flight mode that you're so trained to protect and fight against when you're overseas at war. I think some of the statistics I saw was 11 million veterans induce some sort of effects of PTSD, and as many as 20% that served in Iraq and Afghanistan suffer from it. Now, that's just reported. I'm sure that number is actually higher than just 20%, but this is really common for our vets to suffer from. And I think it's important to know that there are resources out there to deal with this, to know the signs, but to also be able to get help and get treated for PTSD, because it's really important.
Absolutely. You know, we can't really determine who is actually going to experience PTSD symptoms, But we do know that if you've had, previous trauma, or, someone in your family has had trauma, or if there's just like a lack of social support, those are elevated risk factors that can contribute to that. And there are a lot of resources out there. It's really important to, look into therapy. There's, different modalities that have really been promising, some in which you don't even need to talk about what happens. Like if you were doing, the rapid eye movement, so EMDR or ART, those are all really good options that, people can look into.
Can you explain that a little bit more? What is rapid eye movement? Because that's, when you think of typical therapy, and I've opened up on this on previous episodes, I go to therapy. I do it, biweekly, and it's kind of opening up and talking about my feelings, but you're going through some practical things to work with PTSD. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so it's one good option when people are really afraid of being flooded and, talking about what happened. You know, the rapid eye movement is really good because it's not stereotypical talk therapy. We're using eye movement to help sort of recode or rewrite that memory. And you can share, bits and pieces of it with the clinician that you're working with. But if you don't want to share anything at all, you can, and you can still get relief from symptoms. I think a lot of times people are hesitant to go into therapy because they feel like they're just never going to get relief from their symptoms. But, if you want to, you can.
And looking about and covering really the recent news, whether it be the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, the suicide bombing attacks at Kabul airport where we lost 13 service members, or really just the end of America's longest war. All of this is resurfacing in our daily dialogue. It's being shown over and over, images on national television and local television. This has to be somewhat jarring, and I'm sure in the work that you've done recently with some of our veterans to see this, to relive this. Can you just express maybe what some of our veterans are really going through right now, reliving, America's longest war in real time, really?
It's absolutely triggering for them, and watching those videos can really bring about like a visceral response, right? That it's in your body, and they feel it. It's that flooding of emotions. So yeah, this is definitely a very difficult time for them. And just the feeling of, well, did everything I do in the military have value? I think that also plays a piece in it mentally as well.
And especially when there's coverage of, was the war worth it, right? Was the billions and billions of dollars spent, were the lives lost worth it? Especially, not to get too into the weeds here, but with the Taliban regaining control and power in Afghanistan, how do you work through, and how would a veteran or maybe a loved one that served work through sort of those feelings of, was it worth it? And did we accomplish the goal? How do you work through that?
It's a really, complicated process, and it's something that's very individualistic, right? Everybody experiences trauma differently. And so, finding somebody that you trust completely, what we know is that the therapeutic relationship is everything. So like if you have to shop around for a therapist, if you feel more comfortable talking with other veterans, really what's important is that you're talking about it.
A veteran support group can be important too, right? Like getting in touch with and knowing that you're not alone, because as we just went over, 11 million veterans endure PTSD, sort of symptoms and side effects, and battle through it. Just having that support system there can really help somebody get through it.
Absolutely. One really interesting theory that I've heard in relation to PTSD is that back in World War II, because they were in ships and because it took so long to get back to the United States, they were able to, process it together and talk about it. And it was just, a long process instead of just, sort of flying back and not really having anyone to talk to. And feeling alone.
That's actually, I didn't even think about that, right? They don't have maybe the time to download right now, right? And just kind of reassess and think through it. And that's one of the topics I wanted to talk to you about, is just how difficult it is to readjust to life after the structure of military service, especially if you don't get the opportunity to truly work out some of what you just saw or battled overseas. Like that adjustment, we don't talk about that enough. We don't talk about how difficult it is for our service members to readjust to regular daily life.
Absolutely. There's no program to help people readjust and reacclimate to life. You're going from bombing to just casually walking through the grocery store. Like that's very traumatic, that in and of itself. And what's interesting to me is you don't even need to have been in active duty or combat to really struggle with that adjustment, right? So imagine living on base and everything is provided for you. There's a community, there's camaraderie, everything you need is on the base. If you need a doctor's appointment, you call up and you've got one that day. And then all of a sudden you're out and not everything is provided for you. You're not getting detailed instructions on how to navigate the VA system or, live daily life. If you want a doctor's appointment, sorry, you're gonna wait a couple weeks. And that's something that's very difficult for, individuals who've been through the military to process.
Are there some simple steps maybe that you've worked through with some of your clients that are practical and you can put into use just to try and reacclimate? Maybe give me three if you have them, just to better acclimate yourself after coming over from service back into regular daily life.
Really just sort of taking your time doing daily activities is helpful. Reconnecting with individuals that you served with and spending time with family. Really having a good support system is key in any mental health disorder.
One of the things that I read that was kind of jarring, and we talk a lot about those that have died in the line of duty, right, or that have died serving our country and paying the ultimate sacrifice. But there's so many that pay the ultimate sacrifice when they come back because they commit suicide. And it is jarring to see the statistics that, one thing that I read from NPR that they were sourcing was since 9/11, since 20 years ago, basically, this week, 4 times higher deaths by suicide than by service. That's alarming. And we've got to be able to wrap our arms around these vets and help them understand that they don't need to take their own lives, that there are ways for them to work through that pain without sacrificing their own lives.
It's absolutely heartbreaking. And it's something that the VA and the military has been dealing with for quite some time. Like this is nothing new to them. They've definitely tried to implement, various programs and things like that. But I do think that there's still, a stigma against going and getting help. Even though we've talked so much about mental health awareness, it's still not something that, we're encouraging.
So how do we do a better job of encouraging that? And obviously this conversation is a starting point, but what can we do to put our vets in a better position to be able to get help, to be able to work through the PTSD, to be able to be on the path to healing? How can we better prepare them to come back here after war?
Just like you said, continuing to talk about it, support them, validating what they're experiencing is important, and understanding that the way that they're reacting to certain things has a reason for occurring. I think, just the more that we talk about it, right? Because a lot of times they feel like, thank you for your service just doesn't really feel like enough to them, or, paying for a meal, it just doesn't really feel like enough for them, because it's, what they've gone through invokes so much emotions, the anger, the suffering, it's all still there, and we don't really acknowledge that enough.